and welcome to episode 12 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning coming at you from the East Coast in Charleston, South Carolina.
And this is Dave Kaloran, but I am still on the West Coast in Napa Valley.
That's right. Yep. So it's 3 hours later for me here, but we're still managing to make it work.
It's not that difficult since I'm a late night person.
As am I. What are you drinking tonight, Dave?
You know, given the topic that we have here, which is ultimately sufficient assumption questions, also known more properly, in my opinion, as justify the conclusion questions, I've gone as extra as I possibly could, as we will see plays out thematically. And I'm drinking, and it's delicious, a Singapore Sling.
I love that drink.
I'm pretty excited about that. Most people wouldn't know that my wife used to manage a bar of over 1,000 people and is like an expert bartender. One of the many things that I love about her. And so if I ever throw something weird at her, she's just like, oh, for sure. Do we have this, this, and this? And then 5 minutes later, it's been created. And so it is a perfect kind of like red, pink color. It's got that foamy top that the classic ones are supposed to have.
There you go. Yeah, she does make a mean drink. And I've had her Thanksgiving dinner as well, and I can vouch for it.
She's quality.
But, your girl's got skills, man. So we've taken slightly different inspirations on the cocktail tonight. You're going with something relevant to the theme of the discussion, the justify questions. I'm going something more relevant to where I'm actually sitting right now, which again in Charleston, with golf and the Masters on my mind. I'm drinking the classic golf drink, an Arnold Palmer. I don't know if it's classic for Charleston, but it all seemed to fit together. If you don't know what an Arnold Palmer is, or even who an Arnold Palmer is, he is a really famous golfer. Still is, although he passed away a couple years back. But his favorite thing after a round of golf was to drink half and half, like sweet tea and lemonade, which is just pure sugar. But if you want to spice it up a little bit, you dump some vodka in there, which is exactly what I have done.
So, I was surprised by all the sugar. For me, a sugary drink is exactly right up my alley. But for you, you're less sugar focused than I am.
Yeah. Well, I'm chasing shots of tequila with my Arnold Palmer. That's not true, but I wish it was.
I was going to say, this could be a very short episode if that's right. Actually the case.
So that's all for me. I'll sign off. False, actually.
You're done after 10 minutes.
The good news about me drinking a sweet drink is I'm going to drink it about as slow as you've ever seen. So.
Good. Well, in keeping with tonight's theme about justify the conclusion, we've chosen a throwback song from, another person that's pretty famous in the music world, although her fame is starting to diminish now as she gets older, and that would be Madonna. That's right. And this is a song that goes way back into the early 90s, and the song is Justify My Love. And obviously the focus here is on the justify theme.
Yeah, it's a little on the nose, but it works.
We had to stretch this one slightly, but I will tell you that it is really difficult to come up with songs that actually match this idea. That I thought was the clear winner in terms of the ones that we consider. And for those of you wondering how much thought we put into it, probably the music gets the greatest amount of thought, then the drinks.
Yeah, once the drinks are made.
Everything else is easy. Those are the two most difficult elements right there.
Yeah. Although I will say it was a little tricky to pick the song tonight, but I'm going to drop an unexpected honorable mention, if you'll indulge me for a second.
Please.
To my man, Herbie Hancock. If you don't know, full props to Herbie. He had a song back in the early 70s, I think 73 or so, called Actual Proof. It's a long song. I think it's all instrumental. But again, keeping to the theme tonight about taking arguments and proving them to be true, as we'll discuss, I thought that'd be a good one. If you feel like kind of grooving out a little bit, Madonna's not your jam, go pull up Herbie Hancock, Actual Proof. That's a good beat.
That's a very different jam than Madonna.
That's right. Yeah, he has talent.
He had talent. She's got a certain type of talent, too. It's just different.
Yeah.
She's one of the greatest self-promoters ever in the music world, in my opinion.
I'll give you that. Speaking of self-promotion, what's LSAC up to?
Well,
you like that transition?
I don't think they'll like that.
No, probably not.
But that wasn't that much of a rip. I think the big thing that is coming up for LSAC is we've got score release coming up very soon. Mm-hmm. So April 19th is the date of score release. And for those of you who have not been through this process or who are wondering really what it's like, typically what they do is they start releasing scores around 9 a.m. Eastern time. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to come out at midnight for the last several LSATs. It's
They
been
learned that
9 a.m. It's not as if all the scores release right at 9 a.m. though. So if you're sitting there and you're hitting refresh or you're looking for your score, it can take a number of hours. They seem to have speeded up the process. I will say that. But overall, if you don't get your score in the first hour, it's not that big of a deal. And just to kind of like minimize any concerns, they don't send out scores in order from highest to lowest, or lowest to highest for that matter, or any really appreciable way of telling how the scores are coming out. It's not by the chronology of your name, the alphabetics. It's not by where you live. It's none of those things. So it seems to be almost random. I'm sure it's not quite random, but as far as you can tell as a test taker, no easy way to see what it is. So you just have to wait. And if it's been an hour or two, that is not a big deal. I've known of people who have had to wait well over 12 hours before for scores, and in some cases, several days, although that is extremely rare, and there's usually a reason for that. So a couple hours is no big deal. You just have to wait it out, and hopefully you've got something else to do on Friday morning and to deal with that.
Yeah, try to occupy yourself with something else other than just staring at a computer screen. You'll also get the email at the same time your account updates. So whether you're refreshing your email, refreshing your LSAC account, it's more or less simultaneous. If you just want to wait for the email to come through, that's your clear sign that the scores are out. I will say too, guys, Dave just mentioned that the scores won't come out at midnight of, I guess, the day of, night before, but your account may update the night before, not with a score, but you may see it change. It just means they've started the countdown, basically, the process.
Yeah, typically icons turn gray.
That's right.
Just a little bit after midnight. And that, on various chat boards, usually causes a wave of freak out where people are like, oh, I'm gray. And of course, in the old days, and I say that, and that was a year ago, icons would turn gray at any given hour, and that meant that scores were about to start releasing, usually within about 10 to 15 minutes. Right. That is no longer what it means. They just set the account to change over at midnight or so, and so all the accounts switch over, but recently it's been 9 a.m. when they started releasing, and that is Eastern time. So for those of you on the West Coast, you still have it's going to be 6 a.m. for you.
But again, no reason to set alarms for 5:50 a.m. if you're here on the West Coast. You can just wait it out. The score's going to be there regardless.
Oh, yeah. I'm seeing people right now like, do you think it's a good idea to hit F5? I'm like, no. It's not that great of an idea anyway. You're just wasting resources and time, but certainly not, 3 days beforehand or a week beforehand or whatever it may be in the future whenever you hear this. Just wait until the 19th and then start worrying about it, not beforehand.
Yeah, people wear their keyboards out for no good reason.
Yeah, the current system is great. We've already talked about this in a past episode. Love the way they do it now. Really pleased with the updates they've made.
Yeah, and part of what I'm pleased with for this particular situation is the score comes out about 5 days before the registration deadline for the next available LSAT. April 24th is the last day. I think it's 11:59 p.m. Eastern that night is the last day to register for the June 3rd test later this summer. June 3rd being the last guaranteed paper test in North America. So if that's a priority for you, you have till April 24th to get registered if you haven't already.
Yeah, and they also say that they will take registrations up to 11:59 online, but they prefer or advise you to try to register during their business hours. So if you have some kind of problem, then you have the opportunity to talk to them directly. So it's usually 5 or 6 that they close.
Day of, time. At least. That's what they recommend. They also recommend if it's a day of registration. So if you're like, whatever day that is, that Wednesday, if you're doing it on the 24th, call them. Don't just trust their online system to work.
Yeah, so the big deal, obviously score release coming here very soon, and then the registration deadline for the next test thereafter. They also released another law:fully blog, more about diverse possibilities in life and law. The big difference here is there's 3 stories this time, and they got some video to go along with it, so a technological upgrade.
Yeah, it was a nice touch.
On their part. Always nice, something different.
Kind of humanizes
I, again, would say, if LSAC's listening, please give us more LSAT stuff. I want more LSAT-related blogs, more LSAT-related stats, because that's the real focus here.
Yeah, stats, yes. Test changes, no.
No, I'm good with that. But releasing a lot more information about the various digital formatting stuff and writing sample stuff and so forth.
That would be helpful.
But a relatively exciting week in terms of score release, but not a whole lot of news aside from everybody just waiting.
That's right.
So let's move on.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to the the theme of the evening, which is sufficient assumptions. Justify the conclusion questions, which is what we'll primarily refer to them as we move through this.
That's exactly right. And as we talked about last week, there are different naming conventions out there for these questions. And we really were, I think, the first course to have these questions extensively covered in our materials. And so there was no use of the sufficient assumption term because it hadn't really come out. And I explained last week why we chose justify the conclusion, because that directly describes your task here.
Yeah.
In these questions, you are being asked to find an answer that, when it is added to the information you have, proves the conclusion.
Yeah.
It justifies it.
Yeah, and that chosen name also predates anything that LSAC assigned to it, as I understand. So we didn't even have their nomenclature to work from or to ape. We had to do our own thing. And I think you're right, Dave. I think we were the first ones to categorically distinguish these two question types from one another, which, as we will see going through this, is a crucial distinction to make.
Yeah, especially because when you look at the question stems, you see the word assumption in both question types. Mm-hmm. And it used to be, you could be like, you'd see assumption and it was the so-called necessary assumption, what we at PowerScore just call an assumption question. And then you started to see a difference in presentation and difference in the types of answers that you see. And this is where it really gets confusing, I think, for students, because there is a big amount of overlap between these two types of questions in terms of their correct answers. And that is sometimes the kind of thing that you see people asking, like, I don't understand how to separate the two.
Right.
We talked last week about how a necessary assumption is something that the conclusion relies on. And so we use this model where it's like, if you have a valid conclusion, then you know that the assumptions are valid and the answer that is correct is going to be true as well. Here, the model reverses. And the reason it's called a sufficient assumption is that in these cases, when you have a correct answer, it is sufficient to prove that your conclusion is valid. So going back to something you talked about last week with the second family model of questions, which includes strengthen, justify, assumption, and resolve. Mm-hmm. What this is you're doing something that is helpful to the argument. You are, by definition, strengthening the argument. And so sometimes the question that people ask me is like, well, if I'm strengthening the argument, what's the difference between a strengthen and a justify question? And that's actually one of my favorite questions to get.
I like that too.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably use the example that we were talking about last week about golfing in just a second to kind of show the difference between these answers just one more time. But a strengthen question, the correct answer helps the argument in some way. It might be a little bit, it might be a lot. You know, numerically, it might be 1%, it might be 5%, it might be 50%. It could be 100%, which in our example, 100% would be proof. For a justify question, you are looking not for an answer that's 1% or 5%. You're looking for the 100% answer. This answer has to make that conclusion follow.
Yeah.
And that's a point that we'll expand upon in just a little bit. But
for sure.
John, do you want to pull back up that golf example and kind of talk about
I can, yeah. And what I'll do, I think, as we look at that example and the three, call it stages or degrees of support, I'll try to kind of circle back as well, Dave, to your discussion of question stems, because I want to make sure that people can tell not just sufficient necessary assumptions, assumption, justify apart, but also strengthen, because the use of these individual words, a word like assume or assumption, that on its own doesn't tell you which of the three types that it is. The word strengthen doesn't necessarily tell you which of the types. The word justify doesn't tell you. And they use that word
by itself
sometimes.
Doesn't, no. Because it can be most justifies.
Precisely. And that's actually my favorite question type of all. I'll leave it a little mysterious for now and then come back to it. But it's which of the following, if assumed, would most justify the conclusion? It's got a word assume and justify in there. And again, spoiler, it's neither of those two. So if you're looking at these questions and trying to identify or nail them down based solely on little indicator words like that, you need more. You need the full context of what's being asked or assigned.
You need to understand the concept.
Right.
Which I think is actually, since you've brought it up and I alluded to it and we've returned to it, let's just go through that discussion, because I feel like we'll preface the example discussion with that, and it should work out great. So here's the thing. If you see the word assumption, you typically are dealing with one of these three types of questions. Most of the time, it is probably what we call the necessary assumption. Doesn't have to be, though. And so let's give some examples. In these questions, the language is usually which of the following is an assumption of the argument, or something that is very definitive, there's no uncertainty, and you're looking for something that was required by the author in order for the argument to make sense. So that particular idea has a necessity or a must idea to it. And if you're wondering about that, last week we talked about these questions in much greater detail. So we're not going to focus on them so much.
No, but that's the key identifier to me in an assumption question. It's not the word assumption. It's that the argument depends on something, requires something. The author needs it as a part of the argument.
Exactly. There's no uncertainty about it.
Yes.
It's when you start getting language of sufficiency in these question stems where it changes over to justify typically. And that means if you see a word like if or when, in most cases, that's going to turn it from an assumption question into a justify question.
Which of the following is an assumption? That's required. Which of the following, if assumed, that's no longer assumption.
Yeah, and that's because of the word if in that case.
Yeah.
If is a sufficient condition indicator. And if you're thinking, what are they talking about? Go back like into the Logical Reasoning Bible or, one of our courses, something like that, where we talk about basic conditional indicators. But if is a sufficient condition indicator. And when I see that in a question stem, it's telling me it can't be a necessary idea. So it cannot be a true necessary assumption. But if you give me that example the way you did, I'm now thinking they're looking for a piece that if I add it, if assumed, which basically means if taken as true, when I add this, will that make my argument make sense? Now we're into a justify idea or a sufficient assumption idea.
Yeah. So when I think of assumption and justify, I really think of them in terms of polar opposites, not the logical opposites that we typically talk about, but literally like the lowest thing and the highest thing. So an assumption is going to be that foundational requirement. A justify is going to have that sufficient side, but not qualified down below 100% in any way. So the example I gave before, which of the following, if assumed, that's usually a good indicator it's not a necessary assumption. Would most justify? Most justify doesn't get you to 100%, or at least it doesn't have to. That's just strengthen.
Yeah, it allows you to be less, which means that's a strengthen idea.
Yep.
And, what about the if assumed? Does that bother you in that question stem?
No, it just means if true.
Yeah, if taken as true,
believed
which
by
of the following
answers,
most helps the argument?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a classic strengthen question.
Precisely.
But if you're the test makers, think about how desirable a question stem like that actually looks.
Yeah.
Because you're like, this is sweet. I can throw in all these code words that, typically mean different things, and it's none of those. That's going to slow down the average test taker during the exam, which is always why we say, know this stuff beforehand. If you have to parse that out during the exam, you're losing time that you didn't need to lose. You need to know this now. So if you're thinking, wait, I didn't follow that part of the discussion that well, re-listen to it, number one. But number two, go back and study the various phrasings of question types. Again, in our books and courses, this is something that I think we cover really clearly, which is like these are the things that you're seeing. Once you see the model, it gets easier to understand the logic behind it.
Yeah, the giveaway for justify for me is always that they talk about the conclusion becomes true. So it would allow it to be properly derived or properly proven, which of the following, again, if true, would allow the conclusion to be known. Any of these phrases where the conclusion is suddenly not just acceptable or tolerable, but guaranteed. That's justify.
Yeah, and we didn't really talk about question stems last week that much.
No, we didn't. No, but I think you introducing the practice element of this is an important idea anyway for these conversations. Because to me, that represents the other side, arguably the more valuable side in a lot of ways. We talk about things very conceptually here, as is necessary. So. But you compare that to something like a class or even a book, and you get so much more value out of putting into practical application, something that this doesn't really translate well into as an environment.
Yeah, somebody asked me, is this the way classes run? And I was like, well, partially. There's elements of it. Obviously, we want to talk about concepts. What we're missing, though, is two things. We're missing the live element of students asking questions while we're talking. And then the other thing we're missing is covering a lot of questions and seeing it in action.
Right.
One of the great things about a live class is that you are listening and participating in a deconstruction of each problem. You're being challenged step by step to say, did you understand that? Do you see how that works? And if you don't, you have the opportunity to say, wait, one more time.
Right, exactly. Yeah, knowing this stuff is key, but it's only half the battle. There are people who can quote the Bibles to me cover to cover. And when it comes time to actually put, rubber to road, they struggle a little bit because they either haven't done enough questions or they don't understand the application side. And to me, that's where a class really shines.
Yeah, it's easy to watch someone else do it.
Right.
But good classes will actually have you participate as well and have the ability to kind of make comments to the effect of, I didn't follow that.
Right.
And get that immediate feedback. And I always tell students, I love questions. My job is to answer questions. If I didn't like it, I'm in the wrong business. Right. So it's never anything where anyone says, that's a bad question, or I can't believe you asked that. I'm much happier to clarify and eliminate an uncertainty in class than I am to just let it fester and go on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Always.
I get more uncomfortable when people aren't asking things in a lot of ways because I'm like, what are you guys holding back? Like, clearly someone here is wondering something.
I used to do that with classes if it was kind of a quiet class, I'd first off try to figure out, wait, is there something going on? Like everybody, was partying last night, and so they're all really tired. And then if it kept on, then I would start quizzing them. So I'd be like, I'm going to draw you guys out.
I like it.
Which I
know
enjoyed.
If they were partying the night before because I presume you were the ringleader of it.
Most of the time with classes, you don't have consecutive night classes. I've had some great classes, though, where literally we'd go out after each class, especially like on a Wednesday night class. In particular, I had one class in Berkeley long ago that was it was like a total community. I think it was a class of like 20, 25, and almost all of us would go out every Wednesday. A lot of fun.
Yeah. And be grateful for no class on Thursday. Sure.
Well, at least not for me. I usually had to fly back down
I gotcha.
To some place like LA and teach, or back to Minneapolis, that kind of stuff.
Perfect. So. But assuming, back to the idea of the questions themselves, the concepts, assuming you can tell those three types apart, based on what you're asked and like the context of it, not an indicator word alone, then that's where you really get into this trifecta, this three-way split of how an answer choice is actually going to impact or affect the argument itself.
Exactly.
I think maybe this is the time to bring back in an example and examine the three categories a little more closely. So, you want me to do that?
Yeah. You did it last week. I thought you did a good job. And the example that we're using is one that we draw out of our courses, and also it's in the Logical Reasoning Bible. I think it's in roughly in chapter 9, where we talk about the differences. But I like to do this and repeat that example because it really highlights it when we're able to talk around and talk through that example.
Sure. Yeah, it's beautiful, and I'd love to claim any kind of credit for it, but of course I can't because I just stole it from you wholesale.
I granted you it, so it's no longer thievery.
Oh, okay. Well,
we can use it.
I think it was Picasso who said that's the greatest form of flattery, so I know Steve Jobs felt that way. I'm not comparing myself to those two, but I did steal this. The example that I gave, again, kind of in the spirit of a golf tournament week, was imagine that I told you I have a friend who is a great golfer, which I think is a version of the Logical Reasoning Bible. I think the one there's a teenager who's a great golfer or something like that. Regardless, if that's what I'm trying to get you to believe, that's what I believe because I said it. I have a friend who's a great golfer, but I don't give you any additional evidence. Think of the things that I could supplement or add to this argument and the ways in which they would influence your opinion of it, or the degrees to which they might convince you that it's true. And as a recap of last week, the assumptions are the things that don't really convince you, but they do need to be there for me to have a chance of convincing you. So they were things like, my friend plays golf. Nobody's sold on my argument if that's true. At least I hope not. Please be a little more skeptical than that. I have a friend who's a great golfer, and they're like, oh, tell me about her. And I'm like, she plays golf. Nobody's like, unbelievable. Get me an autograph.
No, but in fact, they jump over it because they just assume that's the case.
Yeah, that's a thing that you necessarily would believe, but that's what an assumption is, just made explicit, said out loud.
Basic, foundational building block that would have led to the statement or been required to get to the statement that you made.
Yeah, or the one that I gave that really just kind of teed up a bunch of insults for you, Dave. I appreciate it, which was I have to have at least one friend. How do we know these things? I'm going to blow right past that. How do we know these things are necessary? Well, consider what happens when they're not true. If I don't have any friends, I definitely don't have a friend who's a great golfer.
That's right.
If
I'm not going to say anything. Last week you said that beer made me mean, which is not true.
No, I'm going to send you cases of Singapore slings because you're really holding back tonight, and I like it.
It makes me happy.
There you go. But same thing. My friend plays golf. Imagine what happens to my argument when that's not true. If you're like, I've known that girl her whole life. She's never swung a golf club. She's never hit a golf ball. Then I'm not just possibly wrong. I am definitely wrong. And that's why assumptions and the negation technique is so powerful. But you can start to expand or bridge out of that necessity category and then just think about things that might help. My friend's a better golfer than me, let's say. That might help. It might not make much of a difference, but it doesn't have to be true. She could be great and so could I, a little greater. Or I could suck and she's better than me and it doesn't help much at all. But that's the type of strengthened thing. Or, Dave, I think you used this last week, like maybe she'd won a local tournament or something. Yeah. That helps for sure. It shouldn't be wholesale convincing. But
she used to be nationally ranked as another one.
There you go.
I don't know if she's now great, but she was pretty good at some point.
That's right. My friend has a hole-in-one. Maybe she's just lucky.
True.
Or maybe she's a really great golfer, because a lot of times those two do go together. These are degrees of support, none of which are necessary. You can be great without a national ranking. You can be great without a hole-in-one. But they do help. And that's what you want from a strengthen idea. It also introduces to me, I think, the difficulty of strengthen questions, which is that there's this incredibly broad, almost amorphous at times, range of possibilities, things you could add that help a little, 5%, or a lot, 95%, anywhere in between.
There's a huge spectrum of possibility with strengthen.
I like that phrase, actually. So as we're climbing up the help ladder, almost all the rungs live in the middle where strengthen is.
Truly.
But there is a top rung.
How do we justify that statement that you made that your friend is a great golfer?
So imagine that we get the questions, Tim, we talked about of like, which the following, if true or if assumed, would allow the conclusion to be properly drawn, which is one of their favorite justify phrases. What would make me right beyond a shadow of a doubt? And there's lots, again, things you could say, but they'd be along the lines of like, my friend has won the Masters. Very relevant. Or, my friend is Michelle Wee. Well, if you don't know Michelle Wee, she's one of the all-time greatest female golfers ever. Annika Sorenstam, I think, was another one. Yeah, or on the male side, Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson, somebody like that. There are things that I could say. My friend, their handicap is -3. Which, again, if you're not a golfer, that might not mean much, but the lower your handicap, the better. These are things that would justify my conclusion. These are sufficient. They're enough for you to know that my conclusion has to be correct. And that's what we want. Are they necessary? Of course not. Do they help? All the way to the top. I think, Dave, I've heard you call them super strengthened, which I always liked.
It proves it. Mm-hmm. And that's the power. Like that one statement, as soon as you're like, well, they won a professional golf tournament. You're great. All right. And since I do play golf very badly and infrequently, and I know how tough it is. If somebody has won a professional golf tournament, it's a legit truth. They are great.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of statement where it's all powerful. It is the 100% strengthener. And that's actually the standard that we're looking for in these questions. The problem is they don't make it as easy as this. This is, pop culture and something that's really relevant to, things that are going on right now. We're talking about golf. Right. We're talking about various golfers and tournaments. It's really easy to see how that works. From a conceptual standpoint, that's what we want right now. We want to understand this idea so that it clicks in and you're able to say, oh, I see the difference clearly. And then you can look at question stems and understand, oh, that's the concept that's driving this language and that the language is actually driving.
Yeah. Although, very quick sub-point, you mentioned that these are pop culture or sort of topical references for what we are. The test is not a pop culture test. If you're not a golfer, you're not going to be in trouble on the LSAT. You'll be just fine. If you don't know who Phil Mickelson is, not to worry. He's not going to come up. Or if he does, it'll come up with the context of an explanation. Phil Mickelson's a professional golfer who's won 8 majors or whatever.
No, they won't expect that level of detail with Phil and majors and all that. However, they will expect you to know what golf is.
Yes.
So you have to know the basics of the world. You just don't have to know the specifics of each subpart of the world.
That's right.
Typically. So at least as far as that goes, that kind of like idea is very broad. It relates to something that's easy for us to understand. But when you get into LSAT questions, what you end up with is topics that you're unfamiliar with. Mm-hmm. And so it's harder to make this type of analysis and see it as clearly because for the typical person, and that includes John and I when we're taking this, there's been many instances where we're not really familiar with this topic. They start talking about oil drilling. I'm no expert.
Yeah.
I know some of the basics of it, but I don't know a whole heck of a lot about it. So if they start talking about some kind of problem with drilling, I'm going to have to go on what they tell me. And that's where the context of what you're doing in terms of like understanding it really makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. So we already know from our example that we're trying to like super strengthen the argument and make that 100% justification. And to go back to the argument analogies that we talked about last week, one of them that we used was the house. And you've got the foundation of the house that you can't see. It's like all the assumptions. You have the walls that are premises, and you have the roof that's the conclusion. In an answer that justifies that type of situation, it would be like adding another pillar to it. Maybe there's an area that's not as well supported as the others or is in danger of falling down. Now you go in and you put a new pillar in there. That's kind of where a justify question would help. Yeah. Where it's like, but it's not just any pillar. It's a really powerful central pillar that connects things together and makes the argument work in a way where previously it didn't, or makes the house stable in a way where previously it hadn't been stable.
Yeah, you take a slightly unsound structure and you make it so that the roof cannot collapse.
Yeah. Now, as easy as it is to talk about golf or walls and roofs and foundations, when we're talking about oil wells or drilling, it becomes a lot more difficult. Sure. And so one of the things that we have used as a tool to explain the way these questions work is something that we developed here at PowerScore, and that's called the justify formula.
Yeah.
And it was really a way for me to understand mentally what it was that the test makers were doing. Like, I like to reduce things down to very simple examples, not just for students, but because it helps me grasp them as well, where I'm like, well, what can this reduce to? And almost anything on this test can be reduced down to something very basic. Which isn't to say the test makers don't combine those things in very difficult ways, but usually the concept that's underneath is relatively straightforward. And the concept behind these questions boils down to when you are trying to prove a conclusion, and I think, as you said, that's your end goal.
Yeah, or destination, I think.
That's your destination. That was the word that you used. And I thought that was an excellent kind of like descriptor there. That's your destination. You're trying to get to your conclusion. No matter what the topic is, that's where you're going. All that they've given you along that pathway are some premises. Premises, however you want to say it. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, who knows? And now they're telling you, find this answer choice that is going to help you ride along to that destination. Except it's not just going to help you, it's going to take you there. So a strengthen question helps you ride there. And so the formula basically says, whatever your premises are, you add those to the correct answer choice, or you add the correct answer choice to them, doesn't matter. And then those two things together should add up and produce your conclusion.
Right.
And that by itself is the gist of what the justify formula actually is that you can recirculate your answer back into the argument and say, all right, if I take this answer and there are each of my premises, does that give me the conclusion? If the answer is yes, you have the right answer. If the answer is no, it's the wrong answer. It has to produce the conclusion. And the simple example that we use, among many, you could use so many different ones.
Yeah, anything works. But
yeah, I love to use like apples and oranges in examples because everybody can like visualize it and picture it so easily. Let's imagine that you have some oranges. And somebody says, all right, I'm going to give you 2 oranges. And so then you're like, okay, I have 5 oranges. So all they did was they gave you 2 oranges, and all of a sudden you just pronounce, I've got 5 oranges. What's going to make that statement true? What do I need to add to that 2 orange statement? It's kind of like 2 oranges plus a question mark equals 5 oranges. Well, I'm not even going to ask John this question because I'm pretty sure he'd get this one right.
Oh, thanks.
See, look, there's
Are you drinking beer again? This is there's an unknown element here, and once we have it, we know that 5 oranges becomes correct.
Now, obviously, everybody's like, yeah, dude, you're just belaboring the point. It's 3 oranges.
Yes.
Now, this is really interesting because that, in a justify question, would be the correct answer or a correct answer. It would also be the correct answer in an assumption question.
That's right.
And of course, everybody's like, wait a second. This is where the overlap comes in, is that as it turns out, there are justify the conclusion correct answers that are identical to assumptions, especially when you're bridging a gap and it's something as clear as this. You can see how 3 oranges works on both sides. Let's try a different example, though. Let me
put it this way. This is the way I would see this.
Okay.
In an assumption question, 3 oranges is the correct answer. In a justify question, 3 oranges is in the correct answer.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It actually could be more oranges, though, but it will be a minimum of 3.
Well,
I guess
not to get to 5.
5.
Unless you're eating them as you go. But when I say it's in the correct answer, it's not the entirety of the correct answer necessarily for justify, which is something we'll get to.
And that would be the next example that I was going to give, which is, what if you had an answer that was, all right, I gave you 3 oranges and 2 bananas. Now, is that an assumption of the argument?
Well, if you think about it from terms of requirement, did you need those 2 bananas to be correct? No. And as soon as you don't need it, it's wrong for assumption.
So it's incorrect for an assumption. But does it justify that I have 5 oranges?
Would it still give you 5 oranges? It sure would. In fact, now you've got a fruit surplus because you got 2 bananas too.
I got 5 oranges and 2 bananas. I'm rolling in the fruit.
You are rolling in it.
Fruit's the new word I'm going to use to refer to money. I got a lot of fruit here.
All right.
It's going to be a good night.
Refer to me.
Are you money?
Yes.
So, but that extra part is really key, because in a justify answer, something extra isn't a problem. You just need to be able to get to the destination. If you have more when you arrive there, that's actually okay. And so now you have an example where it's not an assumption answer, or would be incorrect because of the bananas, but it would still be a right answer for a justify problem.
Right. Yeah, and this is that bare minimum idea that we talked about of assumption. What is the absolute no-fat necessity? 3 oranges. Anything extra is wrong. And they do test this in assumption, by the way.
Oh, all the time. Well, last week we said the song was the bare necessities.
Yes.
Because it's the minimum. You need to have it, and you can't have extra stuff that is irrelevant. Here, we talk about justifying, and as I said, I was going to have a Singapore sling tonight because it's got so much stuff in it, and it's really totally over the top as far as
more than
alcohol.
You need, but at least gets you where you want to be, right?
Sufficient for me, let's put it that way, to keep with tonight's theme. But now you think about this from a justify formula standpoint. If I said that I had 2 oranges, and you have an answer choice that says, well, 3 oranges plus a banana, 2 bananas were just given to you. If I add those 2 things together, I get that conclusion of I have 5 oranges. I may have extra stuff too, but at least I have my 5 oranges. And that's literally how it works. So in a problem that you might be doing, you can mentally process answers. If you get down to 1 or 2 answers and you think to yourself, I wonder if this works, you can always double check yourself by adding it back to the premises that you're given and seeing whether or not it produces it. Do you need to do that to all 5 answers?
No.
I don't think so. I kind of do it automatically, but that's part of the process that I use heuristically to go through these problems. I don't think it's something that most people need or want to do. I kind of do it just because this is what I do full time and I'm used to doing it. I don't think that if you're, 6 weeks into the LSAT and you're taking the test in like 2 or 4 or 6 weeks that you need to think about it that way. You just need to know that you can double check yourself with these problems. And every time you have a double check, whether it's assumption negation or whether it's the variance test and evaluate questions and so on, it becomes extremely powerful as a tool because there's so many questions where you can't double check yourself.
Right.
My number one goal when I'm taking the test is get the question right. This allows me to certify that I've done that. So obviously it's a really big deal. Yeah,
validation as you go along is rare gift, but when you can capitalize on it, and a welcome gift for sure. The way I tend to think of it is necessary assumption, like we talked about last time. The conclusion will give you the right answer. With justify tonight, the right answer will give you the conclusion. And so you're moving in almost opposite directions with it. And again, Dave, the point you just made about those extra bananas, what a beautiful, simple but beautiful illustration of the absolute necessity of separating those 2 types of questions out. You will get justify answers that are right but have extra pieces. You will get assumption answers that are wrong because they have extra pieces. If you can't tell the questions apart, you are really in trouble when that happens.
Yeah, you need to know what you're being asked.
And what you're allowed to do.
Yeah. If you don't understand the parameters of the game, you're going to lose the game.
Well said.
Keeping with the game theory idea.
Yeah, exactly. There is another, I think, related idea to the assumption stuff that we talked about previously, especially given the fact that not only are they tough to tell apart at times, and some companies for the longest time didn't bother, but at times the answers can look so similar, is we talked about assumptions in terms of supporter and defender, that those tend to be the two roles that an answer choice will play in assumption. Necessary assumption, supporter being a bridge or a linkage, premise to conclusion, especially if there's some new element that needs to get tethered. Defender being that it has to rule something out that could potentially come in and not just hurt the conclusion, but decimate it, destroy it, and it's going to deny that harmful potentiality. Justify questions work similarly in both fields, or in both aspects, but more so. The supporter thing is where I think they often resemble one another the most, because that's just bridging a gap or filling a hole. But with that extra piece that, Dave, you just talked about, that allows you to fill the hole and then have some excess. You can have more and still justify. So it's like a supporter plus. You know the hole has to be filled, but if you've still got a mound of dirt, it doesn't have to be smooth gradient like a supporter assumption would. The more interesting thing for me, and this might be the most sort of high-minded thing that we talk about conceptually tonight. We'll see. Maybe I'm just giving myself too much credit in advance.
No, I would say that in advance it most likely is.
Yeah. This is, too much credit?
No. The most advanced concept that we'll talk about probably is right now.
Is that justify questions can also operate from a defender role standpoint. In assumption. Necessary assumption, that defender simply had to rule out, close off one avenue of attack. Think, though, if you've got a justify question with multiple ways that you could attack that conclusion, multiple ways that conclusion could fail. What does that justify answer choice have to do at that point? It has to close every one of those doors. It has to prevent every one of those potential negatives, consequences, harms from being true. In other words, it doesn't just defend a single point of ingress or vulnerability. It defends all of them. And this is, to me, one of the hardest things they do with justify. When justify is conditional, you're closing a gap, you're adding 3 oranges. Most people can see that.
Connector kind of
ideas.
Close
exactly.
the gap is the easiest way to see
Especially once you know that you can close the gap and have extra pieces that are irrelevant. Then that idea of justify, I think, is largely covered. But the defensive nature of justify, proving something by denying all else, that is a trickier thing to do, and often what you see in some of the higher level justify questions. Let me give an example of one of my favorite instances of this from a very high level justify question. It's a bit ancient at this point. Was it going on 24, 25 years old? But back in June of 1995, and this is far from the only instance, in June of 1995, the second LR, I think, question 18 or so. Do I have that right?
Section 3, but the second LR, yes.
Gotcha. There was a question there that essentially talked about random mutation, or in bacteria, I think. It's funny, I knew the question number, but not exactly the topic.
It's random mutations in
random
bacteria.
Mutation, perfect. And the conclusion that it gets to is that all mutations are random. And the evidence they give from that is that some of them are, or at least one of them has been shown to be. And in this case, what they do to get you from some, or at least one, to all, is they create a binary situation. They create a situation in the right answer that says it's either all or nothing. Either all mutations are random, or none of them are. And then you have to decide which of those two camps you find yourself in based on the evidence. Well, if you know some, if you know at least one, you can't be in the none group. If all's your only other option, by default, they have to all be random, and suddenly you have the conclusion by denying the alternative. That, to me, is a defender type of justify. I don't know if you want to elaborate or add to that, Dave. But
yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned that being one of your favorite questions. It is easily one of my favorite. And it's also a question that I love going over with students. I wrote part of the explanation for that problem that's in our forum. Mm-hmm. So if you go online in our forum, we post various explanations and are posting them constantly since we have a huge repository of them that we're moving over for free into our forum to explain each problem. But students ask us questions there, and that question, I remember seeing it a long time ago, and I was like, no, I'm totally getting in on this because I love this problem.
Yeah.
And it's a good example of why I always tell people, if you haven't done the LSATs that are old, you're missing out. Because I would guarantee that if they put this problem on today's LSAT in virtually identical form, it would destroy huge sections of test takers.
Yeah.
It would still not make sense, even though it's been out in the public for years and years. And the reason is that the answer comes out of the blue, seemingly. You know, as you said, from a standpoint, they told you that some of the mutation was random, and then they concluded that all of it was random. Well, you now need an answer that's going to help you prove that all of it is.
Yeah.
And having the answer choice that's correct, come in there and be, it's either all or nothing, doesn't look like it would do it, especially when you're like, well, I already know it's some. But as you said, that means that it can't be none. And once none's out, the correct answer choice is saying it must be all. And that is just the kind of idea that students really should sit down and study and be like, how is this working? Because I've had so many students be like, I think I get it. And then when I say, explain it back to me, they're like,
we'll try
I'm
this
struggling here. I'm like, okay, that means you don't have it. You need to look at a problem like that several times and explain it to friends in order for it to actually make sense. But that's the kind of question I think of that we sometimes throw at LSAT instructors when they're doing training and interviewing. We're like, explain this to us. And you can see some struggles even then. But then later on, they are actually able to pick it up. But I think it's a great example of what you're talking about because it knocks out that whole other possibility that's there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one way you can prove an argument. If you can show that no alternative exists, well, then that has to be a true conclusion. It's the only thing that could be. But again, that's a very roundabout way of arriving there as opposed to the much more direct way, which a lot of people, I'm sure, on that question were hoping to see. You don't just go straight from some to all. There's no mention of some in the right answer choice. So you have to be thinking about this from a dual sense. There's a duality in terms of possibilities for the test makers.
Yeah. And of course, the sum connects to the it's not none, which is how they're actually able to link these ideas together. But I think that actually serves up as a perfect platform for the basic analysis approach that we use with these questions. And it's built around the fact that the majority of them operate in this way. And as I always tell people, it's like when we start talking about models like supporter defender, or in this case, what we call the mechanistic approach, it's a way of understanding how a lot of these questions work. Can they build exceptions? Yeah. More likely, they'll hide the exceptions or they'll hide language that makes it look like an exception.
Right.
So in some cases, an answer will do exactly what we thought it is, but the way they phrased it, it's undercover. So in something like this, every once in a while, people will ask me, like, I don't see the mechanistic aspect. And I will say there are ways that they can use language where they broaden it, they change terms on you, but it's still equivalent that you have to watch out for. It's really easy for someone to say, oh, I like the way this idea works, so I'm going to reduce it to this every time. The people who make this test are better than that. We've said many times that we have a healthy degree of respect for their abilities, and it is extremely healthy respect that I have for them.
For sure.
They know that this works, and there's many questions where it works perfectly. There's some questions where it's harder to see. But let's talk about what the mechanistic approach actually is.
Let's do it. I want to start by clarifying one brief phrase that you used a second ago, just for anyone. As we transitioned out of this idea of like a defender justify, you said the majority of them work this way. That pronoun was not referring to the majority of them or this defender type of idea. What we're really moving into is this means that you can start to deconstruct these questions. Dave's used the phrase mechanistic a couple times, but in very well-defined, in very discrete analytical ways, as we'll see. Looking at that sum idea and realizing it's the same as not none. Being able to actually match pieces, see connections that way. That's what we're referring to, how the majority of these questions function.
Yeah, and just to talk about that idea for 1 second, the mechanistic, anybody who's read anything that I've written, like the Logical Reasoning Bible or the Logic Games Bible, can tell that I have a certain love for like naming things and having it convey a particular idea. So I don't have to explain the idea over and over again. I can simply say, hey, it's hurdle the uncertainty, or it's the mechanistic approach, as in this case. The reason I called it this was because so many justify questions are actually really difficult to read and think through.
Yeah.
Like some of them are about philosophy and values and morals. And it's like, man, this is really tough to wrap your head around in 90 seconds. And so when I was analyzing these problems, what I was looking at, I was like, I don't need to know any of this. This is all about what the pieces are doing. And it doesn't matter whether I know this is people's moral values or whether I just think about it as A.
Right.
Or, some kind of acronym like PMV for people's morals values. Sure. It didn't really matter. I could see those pieces moving. And I was like, this is really mechanical for the most part. And so that's where the mechanistic approach came from. I was like, I was discovering that you could burn through questions like this in certain instances in seconds.
Yeah.
20, 25 seconds versus like, okay, this is going to be 60, 70, 80, 90 or more seconds. Yeah. And of course, obviously I was enamored of that idea.
It's a shortcut. I mean, that's what it is. What you're talking about, to put a finer, it's really structural rather than topical.
Totally.
Yeah. Reminiscent in a way of parallel questions, something we talked about in a prior episode.
A perfect connection that you're making there, because that's exactly how I see that, where I'm moving the elements around and less worried about the precise meaning of the topic.
Yeah.
So if you think about why this is going to work the way that it works, the mechanistic approach is saying, hey, what is it that you have in the conclusion? Because you're going to have to produce that conclusion. So you better find whatever is in there. Mm-hmm. And because of the way the justify formula works, you need to find what's new in the conclusion. And then you can take a look at each of the premises that you have and figure out what's new there. Mm-hmm. And typically things that get repeated, they're covered. It's covered in the premise, it's covered in the conclusion. So they kind of cancel each other out or literally drop away.
Right. Or covered in two premises, let's say it gets repeated there. I always think of them as like anchor points or tether points. If it's said twice, it's nailed down on both ends. Nothing's kind of flapping in the breeze.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of looking at it as well. It's kind of like, I've covered that. Mm-hmm. It's opened and closed the entire circuit and it's over. I like that too,
yeah.
So what ends up happening in a lot of these questions is that the so-called rogue elements, which you could say it's a new piece of information, or it's a piece of information that only shows up one time in one place. Mm-hmm. Shows up in a single premise, shows up in the conclusion. It's never, if you read an argument and there's something completely new in the conclusion and you're asked to justify it, well, you got to get that new piece from somewhere. It wasn't the premises. It's the answer choice.
There's only one option, yeah.
Yeah, right away, I'm like, answer choice, better have that new piece. And sometimes you can just use that and, again, mechanically destroy 3 answer choices and be like, all right, I'm down to A and B.
Yeah, if it's missing it, it's wrong. If it has it or it has more than it but covers it, it's potentially right.
Yeah, and so in the classic justify question, you're then linking those new or rogue elements to each other. Mm-hmm. And I'll use a really basic example, which is the best way to start with something like this. Yep. Let's imagine that we read an argument that says, here's our premise, all gray cats are happy. All right, pretty simple. I actually like gray cats. I think they're kind of cool. I like their coloration. Let's say they're all happy. And so this is just a straight up premise that we're given. And then we're given a conclusion that says all gray cats are nice. All right. Now justify that conclusion.
Yeah. So the conclusion maybe is prefaced with a conclusion word, so one's fact versus opinion, that kind of thing. Because all gray cats are happy, therefore all gray cats are nice. Something where you can tell what's what. But think of the individualized terms here and the repeated terms. There's 3 things in this argument. We've got gray cats, we've got happy, and we have nice in the conclusion.
We have gray cats again in the conclusion.
But we have gray cats twice. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so that element repeats. So what does that mean for the so-called correct answer that we'd be looking for?
Well, the 2 independent pieces, as it were, need to be nailed down as well. And in this case, we're going to nail them down by connecting them. Happy is a rogue element, as you called it, and I like that. And then nice in the conclusion is not just a new element, but it's a guarantee of the answer choice. You cannot have anything new. Nice is going to be
somewhere in the answer choice.
Has to be.
So some version of it.
Some version of it, it might go beyond it. They might say, they're nice and friendly. They might say they're extremely nice, but they have to be nice. That's got to be in the answer.
Do we need gray cats anymore?
We don't, because gray cats is covered by being repeated.
Yes. So when I look at that scenario, I now know that happy and nice are the most likely answer in some form of connection.
Sure.
Now, you talked about the destination idea. How does that apply here?
Well, we're trying to arrive at that conclusion, which contained the nice idea. which means we don't want nice to take us anywhere. We want nice to be an arrival point. We want to go from happy, a premise, to the conclusion, to nice. So I want happy to guarantee or to tell me nice, not vice versa. And I think the point you're establishing here, Dave, is that just because you see those two ideas in an answer choice doesn't immediately make it right. They have to be connected in the correct way, too.
Exactly. My first thought, if I saw a problem like this, and I would love to see something this straightforward, would be happiness, because I'd be like, yay, this is going to be fairly straightforward. And I would look for answers that had both happy and nice in them. Mm-hmm. Now, that might knock out a couple. I would assume that it would knock out at least two, maybe three that are actually there. So it depends upon the problem. They have their choices. But that really makes life a lot better, and I haven't done any thinking. All I did was just analyze it structurally, realize that I needed happy and nice, and now I'm down, we'll say, to two answers.
All you've really done is counting.
Yeah. Matching.
Gray cats, that's two, forget it. Happy, nice,
Sesame
1 and 1,
Street
here
game.
we go. Yeah.
This is just like, which of these is like not like the others? Well, happy's alone, nice is alone.
Yeah.
Those are the two that I need. Oh, gray cats match up. They have their friend, they're gone. Yeah. So I'm in pretty good shape as far as that goes. Now, you said the destination point is obviously nice. I'm trying to get to nice, not go someplace from nice.
Right.
So in a situation like this, I really want an answer that does one of two things. It either says, basically, if you're happy, then you're nice. Because that if I knew that, then I added all gray cats are happy. That would get me there.
Yeah. This is the justify formula at work. If all gray cats are happy, a fact. An answer choice. Happy cats are nice. A fact. You tie those together and you cannot get anything but the conclusion.
What if you reversed it and you said every cat that's nice is happy?
Again, that takes the conclusion and tries to go somewhere with it.
And if you're thinking... Exactly. So it's going to be wrong.
That's wrong.
But imagine that you separated it out, not during the test, but for right now. All gray cats are happy. If you're a nice cat, then you're happy. That doesn't do anything for me because nice was the sufficient condition.
Yeah.
And it didn't take me to happy. I already had the happy.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to produce nice.
Yeah. If you diagram that out, by the way, and listening to this, you find that you've got arrows pointing at each other. That's a really rough journey to try to make because no matter which direction you go, you're getting impaled.
That's not the round trip you want.
No, it's not. No, it's the sharp end of an arrow one way or the other.
But you can see how mechanical it is and the happy to nice. Notice the variations that they can throw in there. Mm-hmm. We start off with the example that says all cats are happy. All happy cats are nice cats. We add that in here. That's a correct answer. But I can expand that out. And this is what the test makers will do in harder problems. Mm-hmm. I could say all animals that are happy are nice, or all mammals that are happy are nice. And they would expect you to know that cats are both animals and mammals. And so either one of those would work. The problem is that for some students, they're like, all right, looking for happy cats to nice cats. And then they see something like animals or mammals.
Yeah.
And here it's easy to understand in our context, but they'll throw it out. For a cat example, most people would be like, no, I wouldn't throw it out. But what if I'm talking about like bacterial conditions? A lot harder to see it then. I might not understand it as well. I might be a little bit skittish about science. So this is the kind of tricks that they throw at you where they use umbrella terms, they broaden the terms. We also have another option here.
Well, or like they do a half and half mix that feels like a trap. All gray animals that are happy are nice. And it's like, wait, this was gray cats. Little things like that where the test makers are just super crafty.
And we also have another variation they can pull on this theme. So we just used all those kind of connector ideas. Since this is conditional as a correct answer, they could take the contrapositive and say, cats that are not nice are not happy.
Yep.
And then you're like, wait, I actually have to connect that. That would be a correct answer as well, as would animals that are not nice are not happy.
Yep.
And that answer starts to feel a little bit further afield. You're like, that's far away from what I wanted, isn't it? Nope, it's still a correct answer.
Yep.
And so these are the tricks that they're playing, which, forewarned is forearmed. You have to be aware that this is how they manipulate these ideas. If you understand the basic principle, though, seeing the variations becomes a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. They love conditional reasoning and justify too. Conditional-based arguments, because they're so well-defined, are easy arguments to, I say easy, they're very high potential arguments to make 100% or to make valid.
It's by far the most common theme, whether it's in the stimulus, which is frequent, or whether it's in the answer choices, which is also frequent.
Yeah, exactly.
You might have something that doesn't look conditional in the stimulus, but the correct answer is conditional, which is actually what our example is. Well, not really, but
there's some conditionality up there, but they can just talk about two independent things, not conditionally, but as a premise and a conclusion in the stimulus, and then the answer choice becomes conditional to link the two pieces. They can do
That's what I was thinking of. Like an A is your premise, B is your conclusion, and then the answer is A arrow B.
Yeah, or in the example you just gave, which is A arrow B, therefore A arrow C. Yeah. We need B to C. That'll take us there, and that's what
you got conditionality everywhere. The other thing that you see sometimes is numerical stuff.
People are like, oh, Jesus Christ, man. Is there no end?
Well, if you're going to cover it.
Not to us describing it, but just to the ways that the test makers can maneuver things.
Honestly, if you're going to get up there and let's say you're shooting for the 170s, this is the way you're able to think about the test.
Yep.
You should be able to understand that and follow it. And if you're like, I really want to get up there and it wasn't entirely clear, it's not so much that you can't understand it, it's probably that you haven't been exposed to the idea before. So if you go back and study it and then re-listen to something like that, it'll probably make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
But either way, you're typically looking at conditionality. If not, it's usually numbers and percentages stuff, because notice what those allow for. Really tight reasoning structures. You can do it with causality as well, but it's not a lot of loose stuff. These have to be airtight. Justifying the conclusion is a 100% airtight, no exclusions process. If you're not doing that, it's a wrong answer.
Yeah, which again is why this mechanistic thought process is so powerful, because it's really hard to build a cohesive, totally coherent argument. And to do it, you need to really tie everything together. That's what this is about.
Interestingly, before you talked about supporter and defender type answers in this, and a question that I occasionally get is, well, can I use the assumption negation technique on problems like this? And my basic answer is, don't do it.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I know your answer and I know the truth and what your answer is based on. I'm sure you tell people don't. I do too. Because the real answer is sometimes.
The real answer is you can do it at times and it can work. The problem is it doesn't always have to. And that's why I say don't do it. Yes. I don't like half and half solutions. If it works sometimes, but not always, I will typically say that's not a technique that I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, B's right sometimes, but I wouldn't just tell people to always pick B.
Correct.
That's how I feel about some of these like hit or miss techniques. If there's a chance of miss, don't bother.
Yeah, the assumption negation technique works for sure on necessary assumption questions. It is infallible. It'll never fail you if you do it correctly. So on sufficient assumption questions, if you go out and negate some of them, especially the ones that are identical to assumptions, it will then work. In the 3 orange example, where it's just 3 oranges and nothing extra, that's both sufficient to justify the conclusion, and it's also a necessary assumption of the conclusion. You negate that from either side, it will show up as weakening the argument. However, in the 3 oranges plus 2 bananas, you negate that, and all of a sudden the bananas will probably confuse you and make you think, well, no, that's not something that's actually important here. So it's just not reliable to do it that way. Yeah. Can it work? Yes. So if you're looking at an individual problem, you're like, wait, it worked right here. Totally, it can do that. Usually that's when you have a minimalist, correct, justify answer. But it doesn't always have to work, and that's where the problem runs into.
Yeah. I'd say if you want to practice technique that is infallible, get in the habit when you do justify questions. When you practice, please don't take the test this way, but when you practice, if you struggle with these a little bit, start immediately killing the conclusion in the argument. Just set it aside, and then look at the premise and add each of the answer choices to it and try to draw your own conclusion at that point. What you will find is when you get good at justify, the conclusion you draw from the right answer will match what was originally there, which is, again, just the justify formula at work.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I had a student who really struggled with this idea, and I took 10 problems, and I gave them a problem in each case without the conclusion.
Yeah.
And I kind of I had that covered up or deleted. And I said, all right, here's, each of these. Tell me what the conclusion is that you would draw if you went through each one of them. And then they'd go through it, and then you'd say, all right, now let's take a look at what the actual conclusion is. Yeah. And then the reveal would show up and be like, now which answer is right?
Well, where do we have the match?
Yeah, where's the match? There will be only one. Sometimes there's extra stuff in there. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing. But in general, that really forced them to all of a sudden be like, oh, I can't keep focusing on this element of the conclusion. That's what I'm trying to produce.
That's right.
I want to know what it is. I want to know what's going on with it. But this is really a process of premises and answer choice.
I love that drill. It keeps you tight. It keeps you precise. It basically follows the steps exactly as they should. So
it takes time, though.
If it does take a little time. But I'd say you can get more value out of doing 5 or 10 questions that way than you might trying to do 20 questions and not really understanding them. Underlying mechanics. So
even doing like 3 or 4 of them is like, oh, that's really interesting, kind of like practice technique. And it gives you a different perspective on how these problems work.
Precisely. I love it.
All right. Any last thoughts on justify the conclusion / sufficient assumption questions?
No, I guess I always say no and then say things.
I was going to say, why do you say no and then talk?
Well, because, I can't help myself. What I was going to say is that, as much as we harp on practice here, at some point, I'm sure we will circle back and run through some necessary and sufficient assumption questions, assumption and justify. Here we want to establish the structural approach to it, the conceptual ideas, and you should go practice this stuff on your own, but at some point we'll have one of these where we take some questions apart through these systems and show you how it all works in practice.
This is the conceptual foundation discussion of like, let's think about how this actually works. Practice is always key. You can listen to this and then go do dozens of those questions, and hopefully it helps you out.
Hopefully, yeah.
We will at some point pull out questions and do them side by side, and that'll be almost the entire focus of that podcast. But that is for another day. I think we are done.
I think so too, man.
With this episode. So on behalf of John and myself, we want to say thank you very much for listening. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or any other place in the universe that you find it. Give us a rating as well. And if you have any questions, please send them to lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We will be doing a mailbag edition in the near future, so anything you'd like us to answer, we're setting up to do that very soon. So once again, thank you very much. Have a great week.